When Johnny Cash walked onto the set of The Dean Martin Show on November 14th, 1969, the studio audience was ready for entertainment. Dean Martin's variety show was one of America's most watched programs, known for light-hearted humor and feel-good performances. The format was predictably comforting. Dean would crack jokes, guests would play along, everyone would sing something upbeat, and 15 million Americans would tune in for an hour of pure escapism. But what happened during Johnny Cash's performance that night shattered that formula completely. In front of those millions watching live, Cash did something unprecedented. He stopped singing mid-performance, looked directly into the camera, and said 7 words that made the studio go silent and forced Dean Martin to make a choice that would define both men's legacies. This is the story of the night Johnny Cash chose truth over entertainment and why that moment still resonates decades later. The Dean Martin Show was one of television's top programs in 1969. Dean Martin had built his career on charm and the image of the effortlessly cool entertainer who never took things too seriously. His show was fun, safe, and polished, designed to be comforting in its predictability. In a year marked by protests and division, it offered a reliable hour where none of that existed. When producers booked Johnny Cash, they expected him to fit seamlessly into that format. Cash was increasingly mainstream by 1969. His prison albums had brought crossover success, but to producers, he was still a country singer who could deliver a solid performance without disrupting the show's atmosphere. What they didn't understand was that Cash had fundamentally changed. The prison concerts at Folsom and San Quentin had reconnected him to his original purpose. He had stood before inmates, men who could spot inauthenticity immediately, and sung with complete honesty. No tricks, no careful image management, just truth. And the response had been overwhelming. In the days before the taping, Cash had multiple conversations with producers about song selection. They wanted something upbeat, something the audience could clap along to, something that fit the show's energy. Cash agreed initially. He understood the format and what was expected, but as the taping date approached, he grew increasingly uncomfortable. America in 1969 was deeply divided over Vietnam. Young people were protesting, families were losing sons, the social fabric felt like it was tearing. And here was Cash being asked to pretend none of that existed, to sing something cheerful while people were hurting. The night before taping, Johnny called June Carter from his hotel room. "I don't think I can do this," he told her. "I don't think I can stand on that stage and sing something cheerful while people are hurting." June asked simply, "Then what do you think you should do?" Johnny didn't have an answer that night, but by the time he arrived at the studio, he had made a decision. The taping began exactly as planned. Dean Martin opened with his usual monologue, making the audience laugh with his self-deprecating humor and gentle celebrity roasts. The energy in the studio was warm, relaxed, exactly what everyone expected. When it was time to introduce Johnny Cash, Dean did so with genuine affection. "Our next guest is a man who's been to prison more times than most criminals," Dean joked, referencing Cash's prison concerts. "But unlike them, he got to leave. Please welcome Johnny Cash." The audience applauded enthusiastically as Cash walked onto the stage, guitar in hand. He shook Dean's hand, exchanged a few friendly words, and took his position at the microphone. The band started playing. The song was upbeat, familiar, exactly what had been rehearsed. Cash began singing, his voice filling the studio. For 30 seconds, everything proceeded as planned. The audience smiled and swayed. Dean Martin stood off to the side, nodding along. This was going smoothly. Then Cash stopped. Not a pause between verses, a complete stop. His hand went still on the guitar, his voice cut off mid-word. The band kept playing for 2 beats before realizing something was wrong. When the music died, the silence was absolute. Dean Martin's smile didn't fade immediately. He thought it might be part of the performance. But as the silence stretched, and Cash just stood there. Dean's expression changed to confusion. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay quiet. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward trying to understand what was happening. Cash looked at the camera, then at Dean Martin, then back at the camera. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, picked up perfectly by the microphone. "I can't finish this song." The confusion in the studio deepened. Dean took a small step forward, unsure whether this was his cue to intervene or to wait. Cash continued, "I'm standing here singing about nothing while the country is tearing itself apart, and I can't do it anymore." You could hear someone in the audience gasp. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't what anyone had signed up for. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial. Dean Martin, to his immense credit, didn't interrupt. He stood there, his entertainer's mask slipping away, and let Cash speak. "I know this isn't what you invited me here to do," Cash said, now looking directly at Dean. "I know you have a show to run and an audience that came here to have a good time, and I respect that. But I can't pretend anymore that everything is fine. I can't stand on stages and sing happy songs while people are suffering." The studio was frozen. 15 million people watching at home were frozen. This was live television, and nobody knew what would happen next. Cash turned back to the audience. "I have a different song I'd like to sing. It's not on the list, it's not what was planned, but it's the truth. And I think truth matters more than entertainment right now." He looked at Dean Martin one more time. "If you want me to leave, I'll leave. But if you let me, I'd like to sing something real." The pause that followed felt like an eternity. Dean Martin had built his entire career on keeping things light, on never letting moments get too heavy or serious. His show was an escape from reality, not a confrontation with it. But in that moment, Dean Martin made a choice that surprised everyone who knew him. He walked over to Johnny Cash, put his hand on his shoulder, and said into his own microphone, "Sing whatever you need to sing, Johnny." Then Dean did something even more surprising. He pulled up a stool and sat down, right there on stage, indicating he wasn't going anywhere. He was going to listen. What happened next became one of the most powerful moments in television history. Cash began singing a song he had written just weeks earlier. It wasn't on any album. Most people had never heard it. The lyrics spoke to pain, to loss, to the weight of ignoring suffering while others hurt. It was dark. It was heavy. It was everything the Dean Martin Show was specifically designed not to be. But it was honest, brutally, uncomfortably honest. As Cash sang, something remarkable happened in that studio. The audience, who had come expecting laughs and light entertainment, went completely still. People stopped fidgeting. They stopped whispering to their neighbors. They stopped checking their watches. They just listened, many of them hearing their own unspoken struggles reflected in Cash's words. Dean Martin, sitting on that stool just feet away from Cash, never took his eyes off him. His face showed no trace of the jovial entertainer character he usually inhabited. The performance persona had completely dropped away. He was just a man, listening to another man tell a difficult truth, and you could see in his expression that he was genuinely moved by what he was hearing. The song wasn't technically perfect. Cash's voice cracked slightly in places. The impromptu performance meant the lighting and camera angles weren't ideal, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the raw authenticity, the sense that everyone in that studio and everyone watching at home was witnessing something real, something that couldn't be rehearsed or manufactured. When the song ended, there was no immediate applause. The silence held for several long seconds, the weight of what had just happened still settling over everyone present. Then, slowly, tentatively, people began to clap. It wasn't the enthusiastic, automatic applause typical of variety shows. It was something deeper, more thoughtful, respectful, moved. Some people in the audience had tears in their eyes. Cash set down his guitar and looked at Dean Martin. Dean stood up from the stool and walked over to Cash. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something funny to break the tension, to bring the show back to its usual tone. Instead, he said, "Thank you for that, Johnny. I think we all needed to hear it." Then Dean turned to the camera and did something unprecedented. He broke format completely. Folks, I know this isn't what you expected tonight. It's not what I expected either. But sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen when someone has something real to say. Johnny Cash just reminded me of that. The rest of the show was different from that point forward. Dean was still charming, still funny when appropriate, but there was an undertone of seriousness that had never been there before. The audience seemed different too, more engaged, more present. After the show ended and the audience filed out, Cash and Dean stood backstage together. The producers were anxious, unsure how the network would respond to what had just happened. The show had gone completely off script. It had violated the format, but neither performer seemed concerned. "You took a hell of a risk tonight," Dean said to Cash, his voice quiet and serious. "So did you," Cash replied. "You could have cut to commercial. You could have made a joke and moved on. You could have protected your show. Instead, you sat down and listened." Dean was quiet for a moment, processing the night's events, the choice he had made, what it might mean. Then he said something that Cash would carry with him for the rest of his life. "I've spent my whole career making people forget their problems for an hour. And there's value in that, I believe that. But maybe that's not always what they need. Maybe sometimes they need someone to acknowledge that the problems are real, that the pain matters, that we're all struggling with something." The impact of that episode extended far beyond that night. The network switchboard lit up with thousands of calls, and the response was split in ways that reflected the country's broader divisions. Some viewers were genuinely angry that their escapist entertainment had been interrupted by something heavy and uncomfortable. They had tuned in to forget their troubles, not to be confronted with them. But far more people called to say thank you. They called to say that seeing someone speak honestly about struggle and pain on national television had meant more to them than any amount of comedy or distraction ever could. They said it made them feel less alone. They said it gave them permission to acknowledge their own difficulties instead of pretending everything was fine. For Dean Martin, the experience shifted something in how he approached his show. He didn't transform into a serious political commentator, but he became more willing to let moments breathe, to allow guests to be real rather than just entertaining. For Johnny Cash, the moment reinforced a commitment he had already made to himself. He would never again sacrifice truth for convenience. He would never pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. His music would reflect reality, not escape from it. Years later, in a 1982 interview, Dean Martin was asked about that night. "Johnny Cash taught me something important," Dean said. "He taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop performing and start being honest. And he taught me that real connection with an audience doesn't come from making them laugh all the time. Sometimes it comes from making them feel something true." Cash, in his own reflections, always spoke with gratitude about Dean's response. "He could have humiliated me. He could have turned it into a joke. He had every right to be angry that I had hijacked his show. But instead, he gave me space to speak truth. That's the mark of a truly secure person, someone who doesn't need to control every moment." The footage of that episode became legendary. For years, it was one of the most requested clips from the Dean Martin Show archives. New generations would discover it and be struck by how raw it felt, how different from the polished, controlled celebrity appearances they were used to seeing. The lesson of that November night in 1969 wasn't about music or entertainment or television ratings. It was about the courage required to be authentic in spaces that demand you be performative, to tell the truth in environments designed for comfortable lies. It was about the importance of creating room for honesty, even when honesty disrupts carefully maintained atmospheres of pleasantness. Cash stopped singing that night because continuing felt like a betrayal of everything he had learned about himself and his purpose. The easy path would have been to finish the song, collect his appearance fee, promote his work, and move on. But Cash had reached a point in his life where the easy path felt impossible to take. In that moment of refusal, in that choice to speak honestly rather than play along with expectations, he created something more valuable than any perfectly executed performance could have been. He created a moment of genuine human connection, a crack in the facade of television perfection that let real emotion and real struggle pour through. And Dean Martin, the king of cool, the master of the effortlessly charming persona, showed his own profound kind of courage by letting go of control and simply listening, by choosing to honor Cash's honesty rather than protect his show's carefully crafted format, by being willing to sit in discomfort rather than rush to dissolve it with a joke. Because sometimes the most important performances aren't the ones we plan and rehearse. They're the ones where we stop performing altogether and simply tell the truth. Consequences be damned. If this story of courage and authenticity moved you, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs permission to stop pretending everything is fine. Have you ever had to choose between being polite and being honest? Tell us in the comments. And turn on notifications so you never miss these moments that remind us what really matters.